My name is Amie Ferris-Rotman, and I'm the Global News Editor at New Lines magazine. I was working in Russia as a foreign correspondent. I was with the Washington Post. I was their Moscow correspondent. And my husband and I were trying for a baby. We were trying for a very long time, and it wasn't working out. So I resorted to IVF treatment in Russia, which was an incredibly eye-opening experience. My husband and I went to a standard Russian clinic. We only picked it because it happened to be right next door to our flat where we were living. And the staff there were incredibly patriotic. And even though I'm not Russian and my husband is not Russian, he's Dutch, they were super excited to be helping us have a baby and conceive in Russia. And they were even more excited when they found out that we were going to have a boy. Soon after I became pregnant, I realized that I was being almost revered by all sorts of Russians, from everyday Russians on the metro to waiters in a restaurant, and of course the clinic staff. And I quickly realized that this was because Russia has a cult of motherhood. I discovered that this cult of motherhood has existed since pagan times, through to when Russia became a Christian country and then was utilized by the Soviets, namely Joseph Stalin. And it was, again, appropriated by Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia. It's a cult of motherhood in which women are revered as the most important people in the country because they are producing future, in my case, warriors. And that is actually what I was told repeatedly, that I was carrying a warrior, a bogatyr. So even though I was pregnant in Russia before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I was told I was carrying a bogatyr. It was very clear that Russians revere mothers who produce sons because they do become warriors, because they do protect the motherland. They protect Russia from invaders, and they protect Russia from outsiders who want to destroy Russian culture. But it is with horrific irony that the reverse has happened, and that now I'm imagining all of the women who are getting pregnant in Russia today, and if they are wondering if they're producing bogatyri, if they're producing warriors for something like the war in Ukraine, where many men have ended up in what has been called by the Russians themselves a meat grinder, a мясорубка. So even though I'm not Russian and my husband is not Russian, we're both from Western Europe and also the United States, the staff at the clinic was so excited that I got pregnant because of a team of Russian doctors. This was IVF in Russia, in Moscow. And I also went for very regular checkups, more regular than you would in the West. And on one of these checkups, the receptionist there I became very fond of, a very sweet lady, started gingerly stroking my bump, which was growing. And she said, "Oh, Amie, he's just going to be such a strong boy." And I think I looked a bit confused and puzzled, which must have asked her, "Why do you think that?" And she responded, "He was made in Russia," as if it was the most obvious thing in the world. Because Russian men are meant to be strong. That's the ideal in Russia, and that's how Putin operates, that's how the Russian government operates. It's the Russian male ideal is to be a strong man. I was heartened by this sudden and enormous display of female solidarity that I received from Russian women when I was pregnant in Russia. And this included from passers-by when I was on the metro, or when I was at the theatre, that women would come and help me to the loo, which does not usually happen in Russia. And it was quite difficult for me to understand this because as a journalist, I was reporting on the clampdown on women's rights in Putin's Russia, the decriminalization of domestic violence, essentially allowing domestic violence in the country. And so as a journalist, I was crisscrossing across this enormous country, reporting on the increased levels of domestic violence and women being killed at the hands of their fathers, brothers, mostly partners, sometimes sons, but was also experiencing this really warm-hearted, amazing display of sisterhood, essentially, from Russian women. So it was a very strange clash that was going on in my mind and in my body. Before my human son, there was King Frederick, who was my beloved Russian cat, who I rescued from a street corner when he was a stray and was only 6 weeks old. Freddie was a big part of my life, and he was very Russian. He traveled to London with a Russian passport. And that's a whole separate story, but he unfortunately got cancer and died. And 24 hours after he died, we were told by our Russian doctors that one of our embryos was successful, that it was ready to be placed inside of me. And there's still a part of me that thinks that Freddie gave his permission and that somehow Freddie is involved in this transfer of souls, if you like. So I flew from Moscow to London when I was heavily pregnant in order to give birth in the city where I'm from. And shortly after giving birth to my son, Froy, I sent a little picture of him via email to the clinic in Moscow and saying how he was healthy and thanking them again for making it all happen. And Dr. Ivanova wrote back to me this really heartfelt email, which makes me tear up when I read it every time. But she told us that it was an email for Froy, and she said, even though you were born in London, you will always carry a piece of Russia inside of you, because so many Russian doctors worked so hard on creating you. I must say, in the early days after he was born, and he was born in the winter, I would be pushing him around our local park in London, and he would smell the cold air in a way with an almost strange familiarity. And I thought, oh my goodness, does he remember? Does he remember Russia? So what we've seen under Vladimir Putin's regime is the embrace of traditionalism, the embrace of traditional values, which means nuclear families, which means anti-LGBT policies, which means the return of the Orthodox Christian Church, and traditional gender roles as well, where men are strong and go off to fight, as we now see with the war in Ukraine, and women look after family and are tasked with reproducing children. And when you take that into mind and you couple it with the decriminalization of domestic violence, I don't see women's rights in Russia improving anytime soon. Additionally hampered by the war in Ukraine, we're already seeing a lot of laws being changed in Russia. Laws aimed at conscription, namely, and making sure there are as many soldiers as possible ready to go and wage Russia's war of conquest in Ukraine. But whenever you see laws like that happening, or martial law, which could happen in Russia, then the laws that do exist, which protect women such that they are, will not be observed as easily. Martial law is always something really tricky to watch out for when you're talking about women's rights. My husband and I have this dream of taking our son to visit the clinic staff who helped create him in Moscow, and we've realized that that is not going to be possible anytime soon, as long as the Putin regime is in power. I think Russia is heading towards a really dangerous point. It looks like it can almost implode. Followers of Russian history say there's never a transition of government without a really big, bloody mess. And I'm afraid that's what Russia looks like it could be potentially heading towards. We're seeing explosions in places, including in Moscow, and drone attacks, which are happening with alarming frequency across Russia itself. We're seeing senior members of government end up dead. There's been several of those in the last week from alleged suicide. It seems to be a similar playbook to what we've seen before. And in addition to that, the economy is not doing great, the ruble is weak, and Russia is increasingly isolated as the world around it has more sanctions and more restrictions on what trade and what the country can do.